The world is a strange and terrifying place. Out in the wild, anything can happen. Brace yourselves as we explore the strange wilderness.
Welcome to Strange Wilderness, the show that takes you out of the comfort and safety of your homes, far away from civilization, and explores all the unexplained disappearances, disturbing encounters, and bizarre events that the wild has to offer. I'm Matt, and my co-host Scaredyginge and I invite you to join us in looking for the things that go bump in the night. Do you have any true stories that you would like featured on Strange Wilderness? If so, send a message to @StrangeWPod on Twitter, or in an email to strangewildernesspod@gmail.com. So the case we're going to be looking at this week is weird as hell. Or, dare I say it, strange. So this story is called The Siege of Palmyra. The Martin family was looking to downsize their lives, mostly because of a workplace injury that left Eric disabled and largely immobile. And so his wife Shelley needed to step away from her career to provide more in-depth care for him. On the bright side, and thankfully due to some mutual connections with some friends, Shelley was able to find work in her hometown of Palmyra, Maine. Almost immediately after they set off on uprooting their family and moving home, they stumbled across this farm property. And in comparison to where they used to live, this property is very big, very remote, but it was cheaper than what they were accustomed to where they came from. So it was kind of the perfect fit. It was a massive farm property with a lot of open land surrounded by a very lush forest. By all accounts, it's out in the wilderness. For those who do not know, Maine is largely considered to be the last true wilderness of the American East Coast. This is largely because the population density is rather thin, and the majority of the land is mostly rural. And this comes in spite of the fact that the surface area of Maine is larger than the other 5 New England states combined.
As somebody who is from Connecticut, we actually went up to Maine quite often as a way to kind of get away from it all. We used to go camping up there, and I can definitely say there are some very rural areas just alone in that sense, and that's not even crazy off the beaten path. So really the only other places here that you could kind of say would be like Kentucky, or realistically any of the states that kind of run around or run along the Blue Ridge Mountains, because you have West Virginia, you've got Kentucky, you've got all of them, and those are all like old mining towns. And so now nobody really lives there anymore. And so the forest and stuff like that has kind of reclaimed its former home, but Maine will probably always outweigh, when it comes to that sense, any other state in our country.
So as I mentioned, this property is largely isolated. It's kind of in the middle of this big open field, and then surrounding that field there's a little road leading up to the house, gravel road, and surrounding that is this very dense forest. So the Martins, specifically Eric, and I would imagine his son Sean as well, have always been lovers of the outdoors. They're very seasoned and experienced hunters, and as such, over the years, he has collected quite an arsenal of rather impressive firearms. And like any sensible person would probably be, Shelley was very apprehensive of having this like literal arsenal of firearms be just kind of strewn about in her house. And so with the help of Sean, Eric had actually designed and built this custom lockbox that they could put the guns in and stow it away in the barn. So that put Shelley at ease, knowing that if they needed the guns, they could get to them. The barn is, I think, something in the realm of like 20 meters away or something like that. It was very close. But they're not obviously in her house where if they were to have like company over and there's a kid, like the kid can't get hurt kind of thing. So let's fast forward a little bit to what could only be described as the beginning of these strange occurrences. Eric and Shelley had a really cute tradition of making an evening coffee and sitting out on their porch, you know, having some conversation, just being a loving couple, watching the stars, whatever you can think of. What sets this night apart from, you know, their usual traditions is the couple had described seeing a strange, almost pulsating set of lights just beyond the tree line. The lights were bright enough to be seen from quite a distance, because if you picture the farmhouse and they're sitting out on their wraparound porch, there's this big open grazing field that would have likely been used for cattle and things of that nature. And then across from that is the forest line, and it was deep within the forest, and so the lights had to be pretty powerful. But they were, you know, flickering on and off, kind of to a rhythm, and it left the couple confused as to its origin. So Eric, being rather pragmatic and very logical, you know, coming to a logical conclusion, is he thinks that it's a poacher who is on the verge of basically trespassing on his property to set up, you know, a snare or a trap or go hunting or do whatever. Whereas Shelley had a more unnerving feeling from the lights, and she described it as being something that she felt was too unnatural to be coming from a human or some sort of, you know, human origin.
So just a quick question. Do we know if this house had been vacant for a while or kind of anything like on that?
They did say that the farmhouse was not necessarily like decrepit and like defunct, but they did say that it was one of those kind of fixer-uppers where, you know, it was very rustic and worn, and so even if it wasn't vacant, it could have been one of those properties that the person was selling who had lived there for God knows how long. And
yeah, more of like a family kind of tradition, like it's been passed down through generations or something, and then they finally just decided we don't want to be on a farm anymore. Because I was just wondering, like, if it could have been poachers, like, or, you know, hunters and stuff, then maybe it was like they were just used to either people not being there, or they were used to the people that were there not, you know, and they didn't, you know, mind it or something. So.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of stems back to what we were talking about last week with the Laughter in the Woods, where, you know, we weren't sure if there were other people in the woods that the owner of the property knew about, but the father and son didn't. So it's I suppose it is possible at the very least. In any event, Eric and Sean decided that it was their turn to investigate. They wanted to figure out what was creating these lights, why it was pulsating, and just figure out what happened. I should also add that I have doubts that it was a poacher, and the reason why is, you know, the only way I can see it pulsating is if the person was turning their light on and off. And why would they really be doing that? Because if they're walking around and stuff, the light would change direction, it would go out for large periods of time, and then it would come back into frame. But to pulsate almost to a rhythm as if it's set to like a strobe, then it's a little too mechanical for what could be considered just like a dude with a flashlight and a gun in the woods, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I was just, for the people that are probably listening that are like, oh, that's what it is. I just wanted to kind of see if there could be validity to that, but like, I couldn't see like a hunter just flashing a flashlight, because if anything, that just draws more attention to where they are.
Exactly. Like if you're trying to be stealthy, you're doing the wrong thing. So they start their investigation, and as Eric and Sean are crossing this grazing field, approaching the woods, the light goes out inexplicably. It had been pulsating for however long they'd been out there to assess the situation, but the second they cross the field and are approaching the tree line, it extinguishes. And Eric had actually noted that the woods were surprisingly quiet, like too quiet for an average night in nature. Like there's always that ambient noise of bugs chirping and, animals making their animal noises. But they had actually described it as, being so quiet that their footfalls would crunch broken branches, and then that would echo throughout the trees. So that's spooky, because typically speaking, that means that there's some sort of predator around that is driving the animals to basically be quiet, so as to not give away their position. At this point, Eric and Sean are thoroughly creeped out, but they still want to figure out what is causing this light, or at least go to the source where they think it came from. And maybe there's tracks, like if it was a poacher, there would be footprints that they'd be able to potentially follow and find a guy who's, sitting on a log somewhere. And so Eric comes up with the idea that he actually sends Sean kind of in a circle. So he takes this very circular path around where this point of origin is supposedly located, and they kind of, they attempt to surprise whatever it is from two angles. Like if there's a person kind of just standing there, Sean would get them from one side and Eric would get them from the other, so that if the person bolts, if it is a poacher who's trespassing, their chances of escape are a lot narrower. To nobody's surprise, they eventually run into each other. They reach that point, they come up on each other, but there's no one in sight. There's no footprints, no nothing. And Eric and Sean are both dumbfounded. They just don't understand what created this light, why it was pulsating, and where it went. It should also be noted that Eric mentioned that he felt a very animalistic, just primal, instinctual fear and unease while he was advancing to this position. He basically described it as being far beyond any kind of fear he had felt while being out hunting in the past. My guess is, even if it was a person, like, I would probably be a little more apprehensive and a little more on edge than if I'm, stalking a deer, for example. But I understand, like, I've been in situations where something is off, but you can't pinpoint exactly what's off, but your gut is telling you something's bad. And it, like, you can't explain why, but you're just afraid.
Yeah, and that really goes back to, when humans first came into existence, in whichever way you believe that was. But that has a lot to do with back in the day when, we didn't have everything that we have today. We focused a lot on the way our body reacted to things, When your hair stands on end for no reason and you're not cold, that probably means that there's something around you that your body, like your subconscious, there's like a specific part of the brain, and I forget what it is, that is kind of in charge of that and will send those like synapses or whatever it is to your brain to let you know that something is going on, even though you don't know it's there. So, you know, your hair standing on end, you know, your stomach kind of doing that, you know, knotted feeling, or just certain things like that. There is a reason why our body does that, and it's not just because of anxiety or anything. A lot of times it is literally because something's not right, and we know that because we may have been in this situation before and something is off.
Yeah, exactly. And this can be tied to something that we discussed in my other podcast, where we discussed genetic memory, where, you know, you may not have experienced something, but in prehistory, early humanoid creatures, you know, whether it was Homo sapiens or Neanderthals or whatever it was in our evolutionary lineage, had experienced something that more or less had been imprinted in their DNA and has been passed down for years and years until we get to present day. And it can apply to pretty much anything. It's why, you know, it's why people are, well, some people are afraid of thunderstorms. It's why some people, you know, are afraid of like water or, you know, spiders or any of that stuff. Like instinctually, it's not necessarily something like you may not have been struck by lightning or have had something bad happen to you as the result of a thunderstrike, but from, you know, years and years past, your ancestors or someone in prehistory that could be tied to you may have experienced something traumatic associated with that it then gets passed down to you, and that's why you're afraid of thunderstorms. So I do think that is why, you know, people have that feeling that they're being watched, because it's a hard feeling to describe, but instinctually I feel like we have that almost sixth sense that you don't, like, obviously we don't have 360-degree vision, but we have that almost like sense where we can pick up on, I would almost describe it as someone's like aura, and they're nearby and they're close to you and they're watching you and you feel their eye on you. It's not even something that's necessarily, it doesn't even have to be scary. Like, you could be in like a classroom and you're facing the front, and in the back corner, completely out of your peripheral vision, someone could be looking at you, and instinctually you might just turn around and look at them.
The biggest example of this would be parents. They always, you know, the big running joke is, oh my God, it's like you have eyes on the back of your head. And that's just because instinctually, as a parent, or not even a parent, maybe an aunt, an uncle, or whatever, when you're taking care of something or somebody, you're on alert, you know, and it's not like you can see behind you, but you can kind of feel what's behind you, you know? I can't tell you how many times my son was doing something that he knew he shouldn't have been doing, and I didn't see it or hear it, but I know something isn't like, I know that something is happening that shouldn't be happening, because either it's too quiet or I just have a sense and I turn around and there he is doing something. So it is definitely built into us to notice very subtly when something is off, you know, when somebody's looking at us, you know, for those of us that hike, you know, you get that feeling when there's maybe a mountain lion stalking you or whatever it is. And it's definitely something, you can't explain it, like you said, but it's there, and you can't debunk it. You can't say that that's not a real thing, because I would say that it definitely leads to something.
Yeah, exactly. It's what we'll find is that their fear and suspicion is not for nothing. Personally, I believe that it's just so far beyond what they had potentially expected, but I digress. So we'll fast forward again a little bit further to a night where the Martin's daughter and her boyfriend Nathan decided to go for kind of just a nighttime walk in the woods with the family dogs. They have these 2 hunting dogs, and by all accounts this should be, you know, kind of just a routine walk through the woods. And since these are hunting dogs, they're very well trained, they're very obedient, they're very strong and tough dogs that know their place effectively. And in kind of a turn of events, as the couple embarked on their walk, the dogs just split. They sprinted away from the couple, which means that they likely picked up on something like a scent in the near distance. Like, what was it? We don't know, but they picked up on something, and it got them so frazzled that they just booked it. They did not wait for Chelsea and Nathan. They just went. And so, obviously, because they're beloved family dogs, Chelsea and Nathan gave chase, and after some chasing through the woods, they end up catching up to the dogs. And they found them sniffing around and pacing this large hole that had been dug, not necessarily straight down into the ground, but had almost been like dug into like the side of like a hill. And Nathan kind of picked up on something odd, and he said the hole itself seemed like it was overly round, like it had been created and dug with very like almost otherworldly precision and care. What freaks me out a little bit about that too is because I used to work manual labor. I've dug a lot of holes in my life, and typically speaking, the average person does not dig a relatively circular hole. It's all messy and it's gross. It's a very far cry from the circular holes you would see in cartoons. So for him to see that, my red flag sensors would be immediately going off. Again, in very similar to her mother, Chelsea was immediately overwhelmed by dread and just very uneasy feelings. And she actually started to plead with Nathan to scoop up the dogs and they can all go back to the property. So Nathan initially was more curious. He wanted to find out what was doing this, and he wanted to investigate the hole a little more because, there's like moss and stuff around it, like almost like what you would imagine like a small, like if you're building like a shelter, you're kind of lining the outside with twigs and various fauna, or flora, I should say. And Chelsea just is not having any of it. She wants to leave. So eventually he relents and they leave. But the question is, what did the dogs smell? And what exactly did they stumble on? It almost seems like it's like a nest or a den of some sort, but it was massive. It's not like, like a little foxhole that you would see at the base of a tree, or a tiny hole that like rabbits would dig to go give birth. This was a large hole. Like it could probably, I'm not sure how tall and bulky these people are, but I feel like they both probably could have fit in there and still had room, just based on how they described it.
I don't know how I would feel, one, about the dogs acting like that, but also kind of stumbling upon something like that just randomly in the middle of, like, just in the woods like that. I don't know. Especially with it being a dang near, like, perfect round circle and stuff. That's just, again, sort of like that, there's nothing in this world that is natural that makes a straight line. It's the same thing with, like, circles. And all of these, like, most of these don't occur in nature like that. So that alone is kind of what freaks me out a bit, but yeah.
Yeah. To make matters worse, as they set out back to the house, both Nathan and Chelsea swore up and down that it felt like, and most likely sounded to some degree, like they were being stalked. Similar to like how you were just describing the sensation when you're being followed by a mountain lion or a cougar or some predator out in the wild. They probably had feelings very similar to that, but they were just on edge. They actually ran back to the farmhouse because it felt like something was following them, but not something friendly. Like I can understand if you're like a deer is following you because it's curious and then you turn around and it leaves, whatever. Like I've had experiences with rabbits and stuff where they'll hop up kind of behind me and you're like, oh, that's adorable, but you hear it and you smell it, you see it, whatever. But if it's something nefarious or predatory, yeah, you're not going to want to stick around to see what it is.
Well, and what it is too is, so the old saying goes, you don't know it's there until it wants you to know it's there. So our bodies will instinctually pick up on it, but at the same time, if you're alone somewhere, or you're with somebody or something like that, it's not really something you pay attention to, because it's like, well, I mean, I'm alone, obviously I'm gonna feel a little uncomfortable. But, something like a mountain lion or something, I mean, we've seen the video of the one guy who was being stalked by a mountain lion, and then he was able to, like, record it and stuff like that. That mountain lion, I mean, he let it known that he was there, And it's the same thing with, like, snakes and all those kind of things. Nothing, for the most part, is that predatory that they are going to just come out and attack you, It's kind of like the thrill of the chase type of thing, they're gonna wait and then they're gonna go after you because it's that thrill, and maybe in this kind of point, like feeling like they're being stalked, like that animal or person or whatever it is probably knows that they can detect them, but they don't know where they are or what they are. So
I would argue that it's very similar in this kind of sense, where, and as we'll see later, like once the big reveal happens, it's almost with that similar mindset where you're almost being played with until it's time to, like, go in for the kill, so as to speak. And I mean, it's a weird sensation. Like, I've never been stalked by anything like that. I mean, like, my cat's tried to sneak up on me in the past, but, like, he's a cat, so whatever. But, just this is a family of hunters, right? So they probably know what it's like to be out and to have a mountain lion or a bear be nearby and to have that kind of unease. But then to have the fear that they had, one, because of this hole and trying to figure out what was big enough to make it and sit in it, and two, that just general unease that's so powerful that they literally sprint with their dogs back to this property. And it's a far, it's a pretty far run. Like, it's not, I mean, obviously they're not running a 5K, but they're covering some decent distance to get back. So I genuinely think at this current point in time, they were almost being, like, sized up and whatnot by whatever it is that, whatever creature made that hole or was watching them. And I would argue that the uneasy feeling that Chelsea had when she was staring at the hole as Nathan's investigating probably came from the fact that it was just that instinctual feeling that she was probably being watched by whatever made that hole from somewhere off in the distance that's going, yo, they rolled up on my house. Like, what is this? So let's fast forward one more time to the Memorial Day weekend. Nothing special, but as per tradition, Shelly had started making her routine evening coffee so that her and Eric could go out to their porch, sit, have a drink, and just be a loving couple. While she's doing this, she noticed that the same dogs, her two hunting dogs, were behaving really, really weirdly, oddly, strangely, whatever adjective you want to use. The gist of it was they were avoiding going into their pens, which is very out of character for them, but she couldn't quite peg why. Regardless, something wasn't right. Something was amiss. Regardless, Eric's out on the porch, waiting for Shelly to come out with the coffee, and he also notices that something's off. But it's not with the dogs. He notices that it's a really quiet evening, similar to when he and Sean had gone investigating the lights. It was just oddly quiet, considering they are more or less surrounded by forest on all sides. It's at this point that he then hears what he describes as an odd sound coming from somewhere out in the distance. By this point, Shelly has come outside, and so Eric starts to feel uneasy, and he wants to go inside. He wants Shelly to go inside, so he gets up and he says, it's time to go inside. And Shelly is obviously kind of like, what's your problem? Like, I don't know what's your deal? And so Shelly typically has this high-powered flashlight that she'll bring outside with her at night, and so she flicks it on, and she starts scanning the whole front of the house, basically. So the field, the gravel road, the tree line, as far out as the flashlight will illuminate. She's just scanning it with the flashlight, and she doesn't see anything. So again, she looks at Eric and she's kind of like, what's your deal? Like, why are you more or less pushing me inside? And she goes to put the flashlight down. When she does so, Eric describes immediately, just almost instantaneously, feeling this deep, subconscious, primal fear. And as he described it, he felt as if him and Shelly were in immediate, just imminent danger. So at this point, he is now being very insistent. He's like, we need to go inside. And Shelly, who doesn't feel this and hasn't seen anything using her flashlight, is still protesting. She's like, no, it's a nice night. Like, let's sit outside, have a conversation, have some coffee, whatever. But then Shelly hears a very loud rustling coming from somewhere out in the distance. And she turns to Eric and, the couple kind of just goes, did you hear that? And so she gets the flashlight and she starts scanning out again. And she comes on to this point where she sees six eyes. Well, 3 sets of eyes. Just glaring back at them. And when this happened, she understood why Eric was so freaked out. Initially, there were just 3. And they're sitting out in a field that's kind of, over this kind of rolling hill that's on one side of the property where the tree line meets the hill. Then they come up out to this grazing field and then the property. They're sitting atop this small hill, just staring back at the couple on their porch. And shortly after they discover them, 2 more join the trio and they sit on the field, almost in a line, like a perfect line. 5 of them just staring back at this couple who has no idea what they are. At first, Eric, being the hunter he is, thinks maybe they're bears. Maybe it's just, they're bears. Their eyes were reflective, and most animals have that reflectivity in their eyes. And he's trying to rationalize it, and I feel like most people would in that moment, because your brain needs to try and associate it with something, or else, it snaps. And he's kind of sitting there going, no, I don't think it's a bear. I don't think they're bears. Then they think, okay, maybe they're wolves. We don't know for certain, but whatever they were huge, and most likely incredibly dangerous. So Eric and Shelly are standing on the porch at this point with the flashlight trained on these creatures, and they're kind of going back and forth as to what they think it is. And as they're doing this, the creatures dart. They take off, charging across the field, heading straight for Shelly, who still has her flashlight pointed at them. In fact, they moved so quickly that Shelly was unable to keep the beam from her flashlight on them. That's how fast they were moving. And obviously the couple at this point realizes it's not safe to be outside, so they barge through their front door, shut it, and lock it.
My heart is like racing right now. I wish you could see my face. This is very scary, because I don't know of any animal that would knowingly charge upon human beings like that, like unless they are like rabid or something of the sort. But this is giving me the creeps.
And not only charge them, but in general, but just charging them when they're on their property, like they're at their house. It's not like, you know, they're out in the woods and this animal stumbles upon them and then attacks them. They are sitting on their porch, on their property, that, you know, it's not like they're not immediately in the forest. There's this big field around them. There's a barn to one side of their property. There's a gravel road that leads into nowhere. And yeah, they charge in what I would probably imagine as, if you've seen the Mighty Ducks movie, they come in like a flying V. Okay. And regardless, they charge, but they're moving so quickly that Shelly can't even follow them quickly enough. She's trying, like, she's struggling to follow them before eventually going, what am I doing? And then she just goes inside. So without a word, Eric and Shelly look at each other, and instinctually they kind of know, we need to now more or less make sure everything in this house is locked down, or else these creatures can get inside. And so they go through the main level and they go to every door, every window, make sure they're shut, locked, curtains drawn, everything. It's at this point where Eric describes how he felt, he was almost disappointed in himself because he wanted to defend his family. These things are now an imminent threat to his daughter who's sleeping upstairs, his 2 dogs, and his wife. And so he's disappointed because, one, he's disabled, so he's not as spry and he's not as agile as he used to be. But 2, his guns are in a lockbox in his barn. So he comes up with the idea that maybe I can make it to the barn. Maybe I can get there somehow, close the door, lock it, whatever I have to do, get into my lockbox, and then come out with an arsenal. You know, shoot at these creatures. Maybe even if I don't hit them, at least I scare them enough that they don't come back. They leave and we can go back outside and live our lives. And as he's telling this to Shelly, he's saying, I'm going to go outside. I'm going to go to the barn. Shelly's immediately like, no, you're not. Like, you're disabled. You saw how fast those things moved. Even though the barn is 20 feet away, like, by the time you get to you won't even be able to get through the door before you're mincemeat. And so, you know, he starts to see reason in that, and so he goes, okay, fine, I won't go outside. They also described that as they were having this conversation and as they were going around locking everything down, despite the fact that they were in their house, this property that they had lived in for some time at this point, they didn't feel safe. And I mean, realistically, I don't know who would. If these massive creatures that can move at, you know, Mach 5 are chasing you down, I probably wouldn't feel safe in my house either. It feels like they could just jump through a window and nothing would happen, and then they could just rip you to shreds.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I would say, like, I would have at least kept the shotgun in my house or something of the sort. I mean, especially being so rural, you wouldn't, like, having your weapons so far away from you, I would have at least kept, like, a shotgun on me or something like that, you know? Because, I mean, now, obviously, this isn't normal, but it's like, I mean, you wouldn't know to be ready for something like this, but, like, you never know what's going to happen, you know? And if he has this huge arsenal, I mean, at least keeping, like, a shotgun on you with, like, some buckshot, you know, casings, like, or, you know, I don't know. I just feel like that would have been a little smart on their part, but I also understand why they did what they did, so.
Yeah, I agree. Like, here in Canada, at least where I'm from, there isn't a lot of people, at least, you know, in the part that I live in southern Ontario, where there's a need to have just a firearm laying around, whether it's locked up or not. It's uncommon. You know, the further north you go, yeah, you might start seeing people who have, you know, similar type of lock boxes or a locker or something like that they can lock away, where they have their hunting rifles and stuff like that. Hunting is very popular in just north of where I live. I have some friends who go deer and moose hunting every November, and it's, you know, it's one of those things where they have a cottage up somewhere north and they have a locker where they have their guns. So I agree. I think it would have been probably, you know, Shelly could have been kept at ease had Eric locked away. Let's say he has 10 guns, he puts 9 of them away, and then he has like a rifle or a shotgun or something, you know, maybe under the couple's bed or something like that, like in a lockbox there, but it's in the property, so that if something were to happen, at the very least, he doesn't need to limp over to the barn to be able to get to whatever it is he needs.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, here in America, obviously we have very, you know, different types of laws and stuff, but most people that own, you know, guns here follow the same kind of thing. Like, everything is locked up as it should be. But you usually, if you own them, there's something close by, whether it's locked up or it's completely dismantled, but you can put it back together if need be or whatever. Just as like a personal safety type of thing, not even like a just to have it, you know. And it's normally just going to be a shotgun, because half the time, and this is what most people would agree on, it's not even shooting that scares the person away. It's the simple cocking of the gun, of the shotgun, that will normally either scare away or stun somebody long enough to be able, you know, for you to kind of maybe not get away, but, you know, in that instant move in a way that maybe you could, you know, dial 911 or something, because most people that own a gun don't want to ever have to shoot it. You know, you don't have it to do that. You have it to protect yourself, or you have it to go hunting, you know. So that's like, you know, whether he kept like a shotgun or if he had like a 9mm or something like that, you know, it's never about wanting to shoot somebody, for people that are sane and, you know, of, you know, like normal thinking.
So at this point, they just finished having this conversation. Eric agreed he's not going to go outside. He's just going to grab whatever it is that he can, whether it's a knife or maybe they have like a chopping axe or something that's close enough to the house that he can get to it without putting himself at risk. And so, you know, he's kind of just assessing the situation where Shelly goes upstairs. She goes upstairs, she does the same thing. She shuts off all the lights, she closes all the curtains, she makes sure every window is locked. And then she goes into Chelsea's room. And during this whole ordeal, Chelsea was asleep. And so Shelly wakes her up and she goes, "Hey, come over here. I want to show you something." And Shelly was probably very, you know, scared, obviously, in how she approached her. She didn't just kind of shake her awake and go, "Hey, you want to see something cool?" So Chelsea didn't immediately pick up on this. She actually looked at her mom and then was kind of like, no, and then went back to sleep. But after some persistence, I mean, she's a teenager. I think she was like 17, so...
Oh, okay.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
So after some insistence, Chelsea actually gets up. And Shelly brings her to the window, but they don't throw the curtain open to look outside. They actually kind of, you know, just pull at the corner slightly and then peek from there. And they're looking out over the front of their property. Chelsea's windows face the front of their property, and she sees that the 5 creatures, whatever they were, wolves or whatever, they're sitting in a similar line on the gravel road facing the house, just watching the house. It's almost as if they were waiting for someone or something, whether it was the family or the dogs or whatever, to leave so that they could then, you know, jump and descend on them. In a really shocking turn of events, as they're looking down at the creatures, they are being very careful not to give their position away. Like the curtains are open just a crack. One of them actually shoots its head up, looking exactly at the window that Chelsea and Shelly are peering out from, and to make matters worse, it stands up on its hind legs and is just staring at them.
No, I don't. If this was to happen to me, I don't even know. Like, I don't even know what I would do. Like, this is creepy.
Yeah, like the coroner's report came in and Scaredy Ginge died of a heart attack from seeing this creature stand up on its hind legs.
Basically. The creature never even had to kill me. It was literally just myself from being scared.
Yeah, and to be honest, Shelly had a very similar reaction. So obviously this is really unusual animal behavior, and you know, some animals will stand up on their hind legs here and there. Like, I've seen videos of bears doing it. I mean, you know, dogs and cats will do it sometimes. But it's not like it will stand there and have like a stance and stay calm and stand. You know, like they'll stumble a little bit and then they'll go back on all fours. This animal stood up, you know, and was just eyeballing them.
For me, it's the snapping. It's the going from just sort of sitting there to them pulling back the curtain slightly. I mean, at this point, I'm assuming most of the lights were off, and then it just looks right up at them. That, to me, I think even like the standing up and all that kind of stuff, the simple looking directly at them after not even, I mean, they didn't throw open the curtains or anything. That, to me, is the scariest part of it, because that lets me know that they know exactly where I am. And that is, I don't think a human being would be able to have that sort of reaction. I mean, and I'm trying to think like somebody who is like a special ops or something. Like, I don't even think they would do something like that. So that, I think, out of everything, is the most unnerving part of it.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like they had sensed that, or, you know, if these are more animalistic, if they're more animalistic, despite the fact that they are also somewhat humanoid, then they could have potentially even smelled them. Shelly's reaction probably wasn't super different from how you would react, I would imagine, or anyone in that situation. She was so shocked and just completely terrified by what she had just seen that she actually stumbled backwards and fell onto the bedroom floor. And she was just trying to assess what was happening at that point. Her brain just couldn't really process what she was looking at. She would go on to describe that they were probably about 7 feet, if not bigger, in height. And somehow, like I was saying, they somehow managed to sense or smell or whatever that her and her daughter were in that specific bedroom, peering out at that specific time. So common sense then kicks in, and Shelly says to Chelsea, you know, sit on your bed, do not go to any of the windows, don't look at these creatures, nothing. And at this point, Chelsea then goes, wait, Mom, what about the dogs? Where are the dogs? You know, like we haven't heard a bark or a growl or even them just running away somewhere. We haven't heard them for a while. Like, where are they? And so Chelsea stays in her room, she stays on her bed, and Shelly then goes to search, and she searches the top floor, and she's doing it as quietly and stealthily as possible. All the lights are off, and she goes into the master bedroom, and she finds these two hunting dogs, these two, you know, tough as nails, like just burly dogs, hiding in the corner beside each other. They're like cowering beside each other, shaking. And so it begs the question, exactly what was outside that frightened her dogs that much? And they probably, I don't even know if they had seen, with like visually had seen these creatures, but they definitely had their scent, and they definitely knew that they meant business and they were dangerous. So at this point, Eric just completely gives in to his, you know, just instinctual desire to protect his family. And so he goes outside. And before he does so, he looks out the curtain on the main level. So one of the curtains that faces the gravel pit that was more or less right beside his front door or something to that effect. And he opens the curtain instead of kind of just poking his head out through the bottom corner kind of thing. And he sees that the creatures were not sitting in that line facing the house anymore. So he starts scanning his property, and by this point the moon had kind of peeked out through the clouds, so it was very bright despite it being night. As he's scanning the property, he looks to that hill where they had first seen them, and he sees that they're then sitting on that hill again, staring at the house. So at this point, Eric rationalizes that instead of going for the guns, he could go out more or less right beside the barn and get his truck, back it up to the property close enough that Shelly, the 2 dogs, and Chelsea could get into the back, and then they would drive away and they would be safe. You know, they would leave the house and then come back in the morning, kind of thing. He then springs into action to enact this plan. And so, as stealthily as possible, he creeps outside and he starts to slowly and stealthily make his way to his truck.
This guy has balls of steel.
Yeah, for real.
Sorry.
He's got to cross about 20 feet, but for someone with a disability that makes agile mobility very difficult, this is an endeavor and a half. And so, to nobody's surprise, it would be the longest 20 feet he would ever have to cross. Thankfully, Eric actually managed to reach his vehicle successfully, and he wasn't seen by these creatures. He kept his eye on them more or less the whole time, and they didn't really so much as twitch or just move ever so slightly. They just had their eyes trained on the house the whole time as he's sauntering to his property. Sauntering to his truck. And so he fishes his keys out of his pocket, and he's literally fumbling with them to try, to try and get them into the lock, because he's just so scared that his hands are shaking and he can't really get the right key. And to make matters worse, because of how frantic he was moving in that specific moment, the motion sensor light that was right above his truck turns on. And because he was so on edge from this whole experience, when the lights turn on, it actually scared him and startled him so much that he actually dropped his keys at the base of the door.
This is a horror movie. Like, this is what I expect every single B horror movie to be. You get out there, you get to it, finally you're like, heck yeah, and then something scares you and you drop your keys and they happen to fall under the truck, and you gotta bend down to get them, and something pulls you under the truck. I don't know, I've watched a lot of Supernatural, but like this just like this scares me, because it's like I feel like it's just like some weird thing. It has to happen. Like when you're trying to do something in a hurry, it never works the way that it's supposed to work.
Exactly. And at this point, he hasn't grabbed his keys yet, but he's trying to process what had just happened. He's trying to, he sees the keys at the base of his truck. He then looks back out to the field, onto that hill, and one of the creatures is standing on its hind legs in that kind of power pose that Shelly had likely seen when it stood on its hind legs and stared into the window, but it's just glaring at him from across this field. Before Eric could even bend down to grab his keys, which is not a very difficult task, he sees all 5 of the creatures just bound across this field. They take off, heading straight for him, straight for his truck. It actually got to the point they had gotten so close to him, and I don't know if he had frozen in fear or just didn't know what to do, but they had gotten so close to him that he said that they were almost face to face. And in a moment of what can only be described as just sheer dumb luck, one of the creatures actually reached out to try and grab him, and as it reached into the light, it immediately, pulled back and ran away. And so Eric just kind of was like, that was weird, and reached down, grabbed his keys, and sprinted back to the house. And somehow he managed to get to the house and slam the door and lock it without getting caught. And he described it as soon as he shut and locked the door, he heard the creatures, stampede onto the gravel road right in front of his property. But they didn't stop just on the gravel road at this point. They actually jumped onto the porch and began pacing around. Now, this is a wraparound porch. It's a very large porch. It's not just like a, like a small, 40, 50 square foot, whatever. So he hears these large, very heavy footprints, you know, and almost like if you have like a dog or an animal like that has those kind of nails, you hear like the nails clacking on the wood of this porch as they're pacing around. At this point, Eric is just way too scared. Literally there's a thin pane of glass separating him from this creature at this window. So Eric decides, I'm not even gonna look through it, and he actually goes prone on the floor at the base of the window to remain out of view. He's so scared. He's still in front of his door basically, but he's laying on the ground in front of this window because he doesn't want them to look in and see him.
That's like a whole mood and a half. Oh my god.
So Shelly had obviously heard this entire ordeal, so she calls out to Eric to make sure he's okay and find out exactly what had happened. And it's at this point, you know, he hears, "Hey, are you okay?" or whatever, and he yells back, "Stay upstairs. Just stay upstairs. Stay in your room, whatever. Just don't come downstairs." After some time, Eric heard those same heavy footsteps that had been pacing around the porch leave the porch, go back onto the gravel, and after working up some courage and likely letting his heart rate settle slightly, Eric peered out from the window, this time a lot more stealthy, and he sees that these 5 creatures are sitting in a line, once again facing the property out on the gravel. At this point, Eric's going, okay, cool, I'm not going outside again. So he goes upstairs and he reunites with Shelly and Chelsea. And it's at this point where they decide it's way too dangerous to go outside. What we need is some professional help. So they opt to call the police.
I have been wondering when this was going to happen because I'm like, they have no protection. Their dogs are obviously of no use because whatever they're sensing is far beyond their defensive abilities. Like, I wouldn't say my first thing would be to call the authorities, but I would think that after a certain amount of time, like realizing that this is a true threat, that like I would call the authorities or maybe some friends or something like that to come, because obviously this is not normal.
Yeah, and just if we go back to the very beginning of this story, this is actually Shelly's hometown. So I would imagine that she knows a decent amount of people who could have potentially brought the cavalry out and done something, because what we're going to find out is that while she's on the phone with the police, Shelly kind of lets it slip in a moment of you know, she's hysterical because this is all happening. She says there were 5 creatures that were stalking them outside of their house that had tried to attack them. And so the police, the responding officer on the phone, doesn't really take their plea for help seriously. He thinks that they're just 5 animals that had basically stalked this couple back to their house and were just sitting outside waiting for them. And so they basically said, just lock your doors, lock your windows, you'll be fine. And so they're not coming.
What is the way? I would think that it being in such a rural part of such a densely forested area, that like police or the sheriffs or whoever they are that would be responding to this, even if she had said that there were 5 creatures, there's obviously a threat on this property. And most of the time when you call the police in this instance, you know, especially if you are in a more kind of rural area, they will come out and they will try to assess the situation and figure it out. I mean, they may, if it's a bear or something like that, they can't always do something about it. Just as the same with like a moose and stuff. You know, I've watched some shows with moose. Those things are beasts, you know, but it's like, I would think that they would try to come out. I mean, because what if it is humans, you know? And now basically you're just leaving this family like to fend for themselves. Like what's the point of you being there to protect and serve?
Yeah, it's basically their slogan at this point has changed from, you know, to protect and serve to protect and not take your call seriously because it might be an animal.
Oh, man.
I don't think it'll fit as nicely on the badge, but it kind of is relevant to this situation.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I say, like, at this point, if my next thought would have been call literally anyone you know in town, because this is where you grew up. Like, Shelly grew up in this area, so she's got to know at least some people that still live in this area. It's a very small, tightly knit community, so yeah, she could call, you know, like a mechanic that she knows, or like a bartender, or someone who works at the grocery store, whoever it is, and they will rally the troops, so as to speak, and descend on these 5 creatures. But I mean, fear works in mysterious ways, and it can make people do some really irrational things, so I can completely understand why they didn't think about that next, and how they had, after basically being told we're on our own, had probably just thought, okay, at this point we need to just worry about protecting ourselves and less about getting people to come here. And that's exactly what they did. But first, Eric, who, to nobody's surprise, was extremely disappointed and angry and frustrated by the fact that these trained police officers basically, you know, told them to kick rocks, as well. In addition to his own physical limitations that will definitely inhibit his ability to help his family and protect his family, has kind of a eureka moment where he remembers that when he was out at his truck and the creature tried to grab him, it couldn't cross the light. The second it reached into the light, it almost hurt, or at least scared in some way, this creature, and so it ran away. So the gears are turning in his head, and he works it out that, hey, maybe I could turn the light on, like turn the motion sensor on, and use that as kind of a shield, a safeguard, to get to the barn, where I can then get my guns and lay fire on these creatures. And that's exactly what he tried to do. So he goes outside, this time a lot more carefully. Like, even in retrospect with the first time, he like crept outside with the utmost care. But then as soon as he gets outside, he just starts flailing his arms and just generally being the opposite of stealthy. But this is by design, because he wants to activate these motion sensor lights. And as soon as the light switches on, he noticed that these 5 sets of eyes were all just glaring at him, almost surrounding him. But he didn't care. He didn't care. He knew he was being hunted, but he didn't care. So, as he's creeping toward the edge of the porch, he then realizes, I'm not going to make it. Even with the light being on, there's a very good chance that it might turn off. And beyond that, I still need to make it there, and it seems like these creatures are just, they're hunting me. They're going to surround me, and they're just, you know, this is their dinner. And so he rushes back inside and slams the door, and basically as soon as he shuts the door, he sees the light go off. So lo and behold, he would not have made it. So at this point, any attempts at going outside are just out the window, and the family decides it's in our best interest to just barricade this house as best we can and hunker down for the rest of the night. If we can make it to morning, we'll be okay. We can then leave and go into town, do whatever we need to do, and just get out. So they put massive, just very heavy furniture in front of all the doors, all the windows. They made sure everything was locked once again. They you know, drew all the curtains, and they made sure that they had as many sharp objects as possible. So they grabbed an assortment of just massive kitchen knives, you know, cleavers, steak knives, whatever they could get their hands on. And as I mentioned earlier, Eric had actually grabbed a chopping axe that they had used for firewood, so that, you know, if push comes to shove, at least he has something a little more substantial and a little heavier than just like a you know, like a stainless steel kitchen knife. So at this point, I think they feel satisfied that they have barricaded this house well enough. And so they go into the master bedroom, the 3 Martins and their 2 dogs. They sit on the bed and they hide. They then made mention of the fact that the second, almost immediately after they ventured upstairs to hide in this master bedroom, the creatures, at least a couple of them, maybe not all 5, but at least a few of them had actually jumped off of the gravel and started pacing on the porch again. It goes without saying, and the family also describes this, that these creatures seemed incredibly intelligent and very well coordinated.
I was just gonna say, like, this is far beyond, it's like just kind of thinking of animals in general. They know how to hunt, they know how to flee, and they know, like, instinctually how to take care of their kin, you could say. You know, they know if one's sick, unfortunately, gotta leave him behind, because if I am going to survive, unfortunately, that one's gonna hold me down, type of thing. But to be this intelligent, like, this isn't just an animal, in my opinion, unless there's an animal out there that I just don't know of.
Yeah, exactly. And they also claim that it seemed as if these creatures were communicating with each other. So they would do this by more or less bumping into certain walls. My guess would be to test for weak spots so that they could coordinate an attack. But as they would bump into these walls, they would growl and grunt and howl at each other in almost, you know, like almost like a coordinated conversation. I don't know what animals can do that. I know that there are, you know, pack animals and animals that hunt in groups that do coordinate attacks, but not on this level.
Yeah. I mean, you could, like, hyenas, or, I mean, you look at lions and stuff, you know, but to this amount, on a specific, like, the only thing that I could think of is if it was like a pack of hyenas or something of the sort that were very food deprived and water deprived, that they would go to this extent, not on this type of, like, a house or something like that, but if they noticed that there was, like, maybe a pack of smaller animals and, you know, they needed that to sustain life, that they would go to this amount. But that's not, like, towards humans. Most animals fear humans. I mean, even a big bear is going to fear a human rather than go up to them and start a fight. Most animals could care less about us, or they are afraid of us. So it's like, this is not normal for any animal, unless, like I said, unless they're just rabid and they're just not doing good.
I think what will kind of just solidify the fact that these aren't just ordinary animals is more or less what happens next. So if you were to look at the farmhouse that the Martin family was trapped in, the way that it was situated, the way it was built, is that the first level is wider and longer than the second level. So, like I was saying with this wraparound porch, it's actually like an outcropping portion of the house where you could, if you like left one of the upper floor windows, you could then sit on this outcropping portion of the house. And so it offers almost like a landing of sorts. So at this point, keeping that in mind about the layout of this house, the howling, the grunting, the pacing, everything stops and it's quiet for a moment. You could almost call this the calm before the storm. Because the family then describes that the creatures began jumping onto this second level, onto this outcropping. And much like they did on the first floor, they start pacing around this second level.
Oh boy. I'm trying not to read ahead, so, like, that's why I'm getting, like, a kind of, like, my reactions are actually real, because, like, I'm only kind of keeping up to where I think you are. And so sometimes I'm like 3 things behind where you actually are. So you are catching me off guard with this stuff. Yes.
At times, the Martins would hear heavy scratching coming from the outer walls and like just like the siding of the house, indicating probably that the creatures were potentially trying to almost like scratch their way in, you know, like weaken the wood outside to such a degree that they can more or less just bump into it and it'll fall and they can get inside. And it's at this point where they're still sitting on the bed. They're all huddled on this bed and the 2 dogs are in the corner. They think to themselves, we are not sitting on this bed, because they have then, even if they just walk by, given that the curtains are shut, you know, they're thin enough that since we're a fair distance away, they could look in and see us. And so the 3 Martins with their weapons in hand sit more or less prone at the base of this window in the master bedroom. Periodically, and as stealthily as possible, whether it was Eric or Shelly, I sincerely doubt it was Chelsea. I mean, if I was 17 and this was happening, I probably wouldn't do that either. They would peer out from behind this curtain in a similar fashion to the way Shelly did initially when she was in Chelsea's room. So they would kind of just peel back one side of it and they would look out, and they would see that at times a creature would saunter up to the window, scratch and tap at it, and then move on. And if it was the same creature, then it would repeat the process. If it's a different one, then it would come up and it would tap the window, scratch at it a little, and then go back to just trying to, you know, like destroy this house.
So they're toying with them, essentially.
Exactly, because I rationalize that if they're intelligent enough to have this very well coordinated attack, they know to wait, they know not to go into the light, they know all these things, and they are able to communicate this with each other in a very efficient manner. They're definitely smart enough to realize that this is a very thin pane of glass. I can just, like, realistically speaking, they can, if they have claws, they can just take one of their claws and push hard enough on the window and it'll just shatter the window. And since they had the lights off in this house, they could get in and there's no light that can protect them, so they're screwed.
And I'm sure with being as like hunter-esque as they are, I'm sure they know how to be quiet. And so realistically, they could break a window and get inside the house and you'd probably never know where they are until it's too late.
So they repeated this process, these creatures. They were playing with their food effectively more or less all night. But thankfully, the house held up. You know, they didn't find the weak spots they were potentially looking for. None of the windows were shattered. They did not gain access to this house. And as the sun began to rise, they heard the creatures jump off the roof, or the second little outcropping, back onto the gravel, and just sprint off into the forest. Like Eric had kind of rationalized earlier, he figured that since they were apprehensive, or if even just like afraid of the light because it hurts them or it scares them or whatever, coming from a motion sensor, all the natural light from the sunrise would have been just something that they could not avoid. So they would need to get into the very dense forest where they could then go, presumably back to this hole where they would then be shielded from the sun. So with all of this light pouring in, the Martin family feels safe. And very slowly, they start taking down these barricades. They start kind of reorienting their house and just trying to make things go back to normal as best they could. It's at this point that Eric calls Sean, who was not living with the family, and he says, you know, come over, we need, like, all this weird stuff happened last night, we need to assess the situation, we need to, you know, take inventory of any damages and just kind of figure out what these things were. And so Sean gets there and they start surveying their property, and they found just numerous huge footprints in the dirt, in the gravel, everywhere on their property. And they looked like they had just very large, very sharp claws. And beyond that, given the fact that Eric is this seasoned hunter, and he's likely used animal tracks for tracking and things of that nature, he comes to the conclusion that the way that these tracks are oriented and the way that they're set up and like the, you know, how they're laid out, it almost seemed as if these tracks were made by something that was almost exclusively bipedal. In an even scarier turn, the family found that at various points outside of the house, on the siding, the front door, just everywhere on the property, there were huge, very deep gashes and scratches on the property. So the front door looked like it had been put through a wood chipper. It was scratched to hell. The siding on the property, you know, like all the wood and whatever material they had outside of their house was scratched. There were some areas that were incredibly damaged. There were some that looked like they had just been lightly scratched and they had moved on. But lo and behold, there is tangible, very physical damage to this property. And it likely came from these creatures, not necessarily trying to get in, but at the very least, playing with their food, like I mentioned earlier. Beyond this, and this is up to interpretation, I'm not 100% sure if this is 100% confirmed or not, but the Martin family also describes how at certain points they had actually found segments and like tufts of hair or fur or whatever it would have been, but you know, likely in areas where it would bump up against the wall and potentially get caught in like a splinter or something, or on a fence post or wherever. But they found various tufts of hair on this property. So this whole experience was so traumatic for the Martin family that not too long after this whole ordeal happened, they sold the property. And they did not look back. They did not want anything to do with this house. And to this day, they haven't experienced anything even remotely strange or terrifying, or what you could consider, you know, cryptozoological or otherworldly or something to that effect. And that is the Siege of Palmyra.
That is so... I, like, coming from a logical side, I have no idea how to explain it, and coming from an illogical side, I don't know. Like, that is one, just a night of terror like that is just a lot. And then two, I cannot blame them for walking away and, like, just getting the hell out of there whatsoever.
What gets me, I think what scares me the most about this whole case is how on two separate occasions these creatures just stood up and had this, you know, I would almost imagine their like this power pose. Like, I would almost imagine their shoulders are very broad, and so they have that kind of, like, you know, flexed trap, flexed lat where kind of pose where their arms are buffed out, and they have that kind of like gym bro style stance that they're just staring at these people. But what scares me out of the two of them specifically is like we were saying earlier, the whole thing with Shelly, where she's trying very hard to not be seen and is still somehow seen, and it snaps its head and stares right at her and then stands up in this power pose. Like, that's an intimidation tactic, and I think that's where we can kind of assess that it's likely that they weren't necessarily hunting these people while they were in their house. At this point, they were almost trying to freak them out. I feel like they were trying to get them into that irrational state of mind where, you know, they do just want to go for broke and try and get to this truck or try to get to the barn or try and do something so that they can then, you know, lure you outside and get you.
Yeah, and kind of going off what you just said, like, it just almost feels like they wanted them to not be there. And that's why, like, It makes me wonder if the house sat vacant for a while, or like I said, you know, the people that lived there before kind of have some history with it or something of the sort, because maybe whatever these were, you know, whether they were human or not, maybe they just saw these people as a threat and wanted them to get out. You know, like, we obviously, this is going towards more like supernatural, almost unbelievable stuff like that you've seen on TV, but you know, you sometimes see like a show or a movie where it's like, you know, whatever the creature is will try to force out whatever person that moves into the new place, because that's not their human, that's not their family, and they don't feel comfortable with them there, you know. But like, also the way that these were acting, like, it more so just seems like they just wanted to have fun. They wanted to have fun with these people, and perhaps their end game was to hunt and run after and kill them. So I don't know. It's freaky.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely, it's not without reason to think that if this property had tenants in it previously, prior to this move-in, that they may have not necessarily like struck up a bargain. It's not like, you know, deal or no deal, but they may have had some sort of mutual understanding with these creatures. You know, maybe it's one of those things where it's like, okay, we have a farm, so if one of our cows goes missing once a month, like, it's not the end of the world, like, we know what's doing it, but they don't mess with us. Like, they won't, you know, we'll see them, but they'll never come within striking distance of us because we know. But now that the Martin family's living here, and they by all accounts are not farmers, they're just living on this farm property, they don't have that same mutual understanding. And so maybe this is kind of one of those intimidation tactics where they're going, you need to leave so we can get things back to the way they should be, so that we can eat or whatever it is we want to get out of it.
Yeah, that's kind of what it seems like, because obviously people have lived in this house before, and so, I mean, and as far as we know, there wasn't anything like this. Obviously, we don't know that. I mean, we'd have to look into, you know, files and stuff, but, you know, we're not true crime detectives, so I don't think that's our forte, at least not yet. But it's the whole way that it happened, and then especially the dogs reacting the way that they did. It's definitely along the lines, in my opinion, of that, you know, that's their land, that is their area, and the people that are on it, they don't like them. They like the people before them. And so, like you said, they're trying to get back to some sort of like normalcy to what they believe is normal, and the Martins are just completely disrupting that.
Another thing that I pondered on when I first read this story is, if by some stroke of luck Eric had managed to be successful in getting to the barn, and he manages to get in and whatever, you know, I'm curious as to if it would have made a difference for the better, or if it would have made things 100 times worse. And the reason I think that is there's a few reasons why, but basically, one, if they see Eric as almost like the alpha of his family, now that he's separated from them, if they truly were out there to do something more than just, you know, stalk and scratch at the walls and do whatever it is they did, at that point, I feel like they probably would have dive bombed through a window and gone after Chelsea and Shelley, because they would have been seen as vulnerable. You know, it's kind of like how a wolf or a coyote or something will typically pick, you know, like a baby sheep or something like that, that's kind of at the edge of the pack, and they'll go and they'll drag them away because they can't be surrounded by, you know, all the big machos. And so I feel like, you know, on the one side, that's potentially a possibility. On a separate side, I feel as if Eric may not have actually been able to do any substantial damage. So if you think back to Skinwalker Ranch and the whole story surrounding Skinwalker Ranch, this is something that we will cover in a future episode, I just don't know when. But at the very beginning of that story, it centers around a family who are cattle farmers, who move onto this property, and as they're unloading, they're moving in, this big wolf, almost like a dire wolf size wolf, comes onto their property and goes up to the cow pen and starts basically trying to steal a calf. And the patriarch in that situation, he grabs this really high caliber, really powerful, like, hand cannon of a pistol and unloads into it. And the first few shots don't seem to phase this wolf at all. At one point, they wing it in such a way that a piece of it actually, like, flies off and lands somewhere else on the property. But the wolf just seems largely uninterested, and it's trying to get this calf, and at one point I guess it realizes, okay, this is going to be much more difficult than I really want it to be, so it just turns around and walks away like nothing happened. So I'm curious as to if he had grabbed one of his rifles or something like that, like, and started shooting at these monsters from the safety of his barn, would that have done any damage? Or would it have just pissed them off and then they realize, you know what, screw the light, I don't care if it hurts, I want to kill this guy, he's pissing me off.
And that's true, like, so what, he kills, or not even kills, he shoots one of them. What is that gonna do? Like, I don't, like, even like I said, you know, with having the gun there, I don't even think cocking, you know, the shotgun would have done much. I think, like, that was just me sort of being like, okay, obviously you have weapons, you should at least keep one by you, especially in a remote part, you know, like, I could understand if you're in an apartment in a big city, maybe you'll keep like a baseball bat next to you, you know what I mean? But it's like in such a rural place, like, you want to have protection, and it's not just against animals, you know, a lot of these places unfortunately have a lot of drug problems and stuff like that, and so it's like you never know who or what is coming around, and so you want to have something to protect yourself. But it's like, in this instance, would it really have protected him, or would it have just antagonized them and caused them to actually break into the house and do whatever it is they wanted to do?
So what do you think these creatures were exactly, based on the description?
I mean, so you're saying that there's tufts of hair found, correct?
Allegedly, yeah.
Allegedly. Okay, so we know that there's that. They sat on all fours, but also stood on their hind legs. Part of me is like, you know, I kind of think it's like, you go back to like a werewolf sort of thing. But at the same time, you know, my conspiracy brain that I have, it could be experimental things that have been, you know, because again, Maine has a very vast network of forests, so maybe, you know, it's that. Like, I can't really speak on what I think they are, but I know that they're not human. I doubt, especially if they looked at them and got that sense of fear, like, you can almost always tell when a human is acting as something. Like, every time, you know, there's a Bigfoot or Sasquatch sighting, like, you can almost always, like, debunk it, you know, the way that they move or just certain things, you know. But in this instance, like, there was such a primal fear involved, and so it really does make you, I couldn't tell you, like, I don't know. I don't think it was human, and I will say that. And even if it was something that was rabid, like, if it was rabid, it would act completely different. You know, there's a whole reason why it's called, you know, rabies and being rabid. You don't, like, they don't think. And so being able to just sit there or stand there or, you know, toy with them, it wouldn't be that. So that leads me to believe that whatever it is, it's something that is smart, it's something that's intuitive, and it's something that knows what it's doing.
I really like the idea of it being something experimental, and this is something that we could potentially cover because it is kind of segregated from civilization. It's kind of off on its own, but there's the whole story of the Goatman and Goatman's Bridge. And one of the theories surrounding Goatman is that it was a scientist who basically had created this hybrid monster of sorts, and when it proved to be too dangerous, whatever experiment it was shut down, and he was basically just released into the wild and found refuge on this bridge, and basically that's the whole story of the Goatman from one side of the theory. It's one theory that they had. And so it could entirely be something like that. Just based on the circumstances, I lean very heavily toward werewolves, because the stereotypical werewolf does not like the sunlight. You know, it comes out on a full moon kind of thing, and so once the light comes out, it's like, okay, cool, it's time to go. I would argue that it probably wasn't like a human turning into a werewolf, if that's to be believed, because at the very least, the way that we have been conditioned to see werewolves and view them and describe them is that they're very intelligent, but they're also very, like, savage. You know, they don't play with people like this. They will just descend on you and rip you to shreds, because that's what they do. And then the person wakes up the next morning covered in blood, viscera everywhere, and they don't know what the hell happened.
Yeah, that's your typical, yeah.
So I'm kind of like conflicted, but a part of me thinks back to the times that I would look into creatures like the Michigan Dogman or the Beast of Bray Road, and I believe it's Wisconsin. And is it Wisconsin or Massachusetts? It's one of those two, I think. But anyway, it's one of those humanoid bipedal creatures that is effectively more wolf than dog, but that's basically just in its appearance. But it is this intelligent but bestial creature that in many stories prowls and hunts and does these things on its own. However, there are also stories specifically centered around the Dogman where people will see it with a group. Like it'll travel in like a pack and behave in a very similar fashion to this. And so my line of thinking brings me more toward the cryptozoological side of things, where I have a very strong suspicion that it could be like a distant relative of the Michigan Dogman, very similar to how if Bigfoot is real and exists, you know, the Yeti would be like its distant cousin, and the Yowie in Australia would be its distant cousin, and so on and so forth. So I think just based on what we've gone through in this story, it's probably something like that. But who knows? Like, there's so many weird things out in the world that have been undiscovered or have been suppressed, and because of that, it could be anything. Like, it may not have even been something like more lupine or canine. It could have been something, you know, it could have been like a weird bear hybrid creature that was created in a lab. It could have been, you know, a set of just something undiscovered that looks like it's a wolf, but it's not even in that same genus as the rest of like wolves and hyenas and dogs. And you know, it's the possibilities are endless at this point. And I think the scariest part in all of that is, I mean, thankfully the family got away, that nobody was hurt, they managed to get out fine, the dogs are fine. Folks, the dogs are fine. That's the most important part of the story.
I literally, like, as soon as you said the word, like, you started talking about the dogs, I was like, I swear to God, if something has happened to these dogs, I will go back in time and I will make whatever these things are pay for the injustices they have done on these dogs.
Exactly. Yeah. So to everyone listening, the dogs are fine. But like I was saying, the scariest part is just that they didn't know what it was, and as such, we will never know what it was. And to make matters worse, they just sprinted off into the woods the next morning, so they could still be out there. You know, you go into Palmyra and you find this farmhouse, and if they didn't do any repairs, if you're there and you find this farmhouse that has this very just brutal animalistic wear and tear, it scratches everywhere, whatever, you know, don't go rooting around in the woods near there, because you might find a very large, very suspicious hole, and you might not come back. Away from civilization, things get strange and unsettling. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok to get the full, immersive, strange wilderness experience. Links to everything will be provided in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and stay safe. Because as you know, it can get wild out there.